turn on the recording. And thank you for joining us for the Conundrum of Common Names with our speaker and my friend, Erin Garrett. Erin, it's all you.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. I'm really excited to be giving this talk all about plant names. My disclaimer as we start is if you have the live transcription on, we're going to be pronouncing words in Latin. So it's probably not going to be super accurate for the names, but just bear that in mind and we will see where we go. So just to start with an overview today, we're going to look at the pros and cons of both common plant names as well as Latin or scientific names. We're going to look at a whole bunch of different examples today. So examples of similar common names, misleading common names, unfortunate common names, and then we'll spend some time looking at tips to using scientific names and pronouncing scientific names. I am by no means an expert in Latin, and so I will probably during the course of this presentation mispronounce some things or maybe pronounce them different than you would. So bear with me, we're giving you tips and tricks. I'm not saying that I'm saying them all perfectly, but we're just giving you a head start and a way to dive into using Latin names. Okay, so first thing I want to do is have you pull up the chat box. And if you know what this plant is, type what name you would use when you're talking about this plant. Oh, I see one Latin so far. All right. Great, thank you so much. So many of us are saying Virginia bluebells or bluebells, which is a common name for this plant. And some of you used the scientific or the Latin name, okay, Mertensia virginica. So that was the first test for today, but we're already seeing that there's two different names that we could use to describe this plant. So let's compare common and Latin names. When we talk about these two names, what is a common name? It's that everyday name that you assign to a plant. When we talk about a Latin or a scientific name, it's that name that was assigned to a plant after it was first discovered, and it follows an international naming code, and those names are reviewed periodically. And then the language used is considered to be Latin. But if you are familiar with languages at all, you'll notice there's a lot of Greek words that are included. And then there's a lot of words that are what we consider to be Latinized. So they're not traditional Latin words, but we've kind of formed them into pseudo-Latin words. So that's kind of our baseline is Latin in general, but it's definitely not strictly in Latin. I will also note, if you look up Latin pronunciation, there are different forms of pronunciation, such as more scientific Latin pronunciation versus like church Latin pronunciation. And then depending on where you are in the world, they pronounce things differently too. So there is no one answer, and it provides a lot of leeway and forgiveness as we're trying to pronounce names in Latin. So let's look at some examples. Some common names you might use. You can say, I have a sugar maple in my yard. I'm growing potatoes this year. And did you see the sale on the macho ferns? If we were using the scientific names, we would say, I have an Acer saccharum in my yard. I am growing Solanum tuberosum this year. And did you see the sale on the Nephrolepis bicerata or bicerata? Okay, so definitely different and something that would take some getting used to. So let's focus on common names for a second. Obviously, there's lots of benefits. For the most part, they're easy to remember, also easy to pronounce, and many times they're based off an identification feature or some other characteristic of the plant. So to give some examples, we have doll's eyes on the left, which the berries look like an eyeball with a pupil, so very distinctive. Dutchman's breeches, one of my favorites. The flowers look like inflated pants. And then foxglove beard tongue. In the center of the flower, you have the pistil, which is covered in these bristly hairs. So it looks like a bearded tongue. So again, very easy based on the characteristic to remember that common name. Okay, another group of plants. Obviously, they look like flowers with a cone. So a cone flower is a great name to remember those by, and helps you remember them very easily. Okay, and then a final example is marble seed. This plant produces these really small, hard nutlets that are white, and they resemble a marble more in texture than in appearance. Okay, but it's not all benefits. There are some drawbacks to just knowing a common name. So first up, some plants and many plants have more than one common name. And a lot of the times it's not just 2 or 3 common names. Some plants could have 15, 20, 30 different common names, depending on where, how wide its distribution is across the world and how many different areas it occurs in. Different plants can also have the same common name or a very similar common name that allows them to be confused very easily. When we get down into some of the lesser known groups of plants or not as well understood plants, not all of them have a common name. So just because a plant has been discovered, it's been described with a scientific name, doesn't mean it was also assigned a common name. And this occurs a lot in groups of plants like grasses and sedges. Many of them don't even have a common name. And then the names can also be misleading. Not to say that Latin names can't also be misleading, but common names can be as well. Okay, if we look at our scientific names or our Latin names, they follow a naming structure called binomial nomenclature. Okay, refers to a 2-name system. For the most part, there are some times where they're hyphenated words that are included. And those 2 words make up the genus that the plant belongs to, and then the specific epithet that identifies the species in particular. So if we remember back to plant classification and biology classes, you probably remember the structure seen on the right here, and how we organize different organisms based on their relatedness to one another. So from our kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Typically, when we talk about plant identification, we really don't look further up than the family. So if you're familiar with the characteristics of different plant families, that's very helpful. And then we look at the genus level and then the species. So as you get further down in the hierarchy, you get more closely related plants to one another. So what does this look like when we write it out? Well, here are 2 examples. On the left, we have a white oak. So the genus that it belongs to is Quercus. And then the specific epithet or the species name is alba. So altogether, the scientific name for that plant would be Quercus alba. And then the plant on the right is Indian pink, and it belongs to the genus Spigelia. And its specific epithet is Marilandica. So Spigelia marilandica. Paying attention to how those were written, you probably noticed that the genus name was capitalized, but everything else was lowercase. That is the convention that we write those words in. And then hopefully you also noticed that it was italicized. So when we're typing, we'd italicize the scientific name. If you are writing it, we'd underline it typically. If we get further down below species into subspecies or varieties, you'd include an abbreviation for subspecies or variety as written on the screen, and you put that between the specific epithet and then the subspecies or variety name. So in that case, you would have your genus, your specific epithet, variety, and then another word after it. Okay. If we're looking at cultivars, so if you go shopping at the garden center right now and you're looking for a specific plant and you look at the tag and you see something written like the 2 examples below, that means that it's a cultivar. So in this case, you would have the scientific name written like normal in italics, and then you'd have a word not italicized in single parentheses. And it's typically a showy name that is assigned to that plant, and that refers to the cultivar. So we'd have Phlox divaricata, blue moon, and Panicum virgatum, prairie fire. Those are two different cultivars of those plants. Okay, just to give an example of how variety names are written, I like to use this example because this plant is just amazing and how we've been able to get so many of our different food crops from the same species. So if you didn't know, the ones listed here and more, like kale, cauliflower, cabbage, Brussels sprouts, kohlrabi, and broccoli, all come from the same plant, Brassica oleracea, that has been modified into many different varieties that are listed here. And this is how you would write them. Notice how the variety abbreviation is not italicized. Again, that's the standard format that we would use to write this name. Okay, so let's talk about Latin names for a second. What are some of the benefits of Latin names? Well, first of all, and maybe most importantly, is that it's an international naming system. So while you may not be a world traveler and go all around the world talking with other botanists, scientists and botanists who do publish and work with international partners are all speaking the same language. There's this one standard accepted language that everyone is familiar with, rather than having 40 different common names, right? With this system, every organism has a different name. There are no repeats of names, and it still does allow for subspecies, varieties, cultivars, all of that. Once you start using scientific names, understanding that the genus name can reveal information about how closely related plants are to one another. So if you are talking about, I'm going to talk about this example in a second, but Dahlia candida and Dahlia purpurea, they're two different plants. They have the same genus name, which means they're closely related to one another. If they had a different genus name, then we know that they're more further related to one another than other plants would be to each other. So understanding plant relationships is revealed through the names themselves, and is really helpful once you start using them regularly. They can help you tell which ones are related to one another. And then naming is often descriptive. So we talked about how common names are helpful because they often talk about a characteristic of a plant and they're easy to remember. It requires learning what some of the phrases are, but much of the naming in Latin is also descriptive and can tell you characteristics that help you remember the name of the plant. You're probably familiar with the drawbacks, right? You may say, it's not user-friendly, the words are difficult to pronounce, it's very intimidating to get started. Let me tell you, it is intimidating for me to be on and pronouncing all of these words in Latin and hoping I'm saying them correctly for you all. So you are not alone in that. And then another drawback is that the names can change. So there's only one name per plant. But just because a name was assigned doesn't mean that it's there forever. As we learn more about plant relationships, as more research is done, as we have access to more genetic information, scientists are learning that more about plant evolution and which plants are more closely related to one another. And so that can result in names changing, which can be frustrating once you've learned a Latin name for a plant to then reassign it in your head to have a different name. Okay, so we talked about the coneflowers already, but let's put some Latin names on them. And so on the left, first we have Echinacea simulata. Okay, that's the glade coneflower. The two in the middle, we have a yellow form and a red form, but they're actually the same species. So this is Ratibida columnifera. And then on the right, we have another coneflower, Ratibida pinnata. Okay, so I gave you 4 pictures, but it's actually only 3 species. If you look at the Latin names, you'll notice that they're in different genera. So just because they're all referred to as coneflowers doesn't mean that they're all related to the same degree to one another. We would cut out this glade coneflower by itself, and the other are more closely related to each other. Okay, I mentioned that there are oftentimes many different names, common names, for the same thing, for the same plant. So we're going to open that chat box again, and I want you to type what you would call this grass if you are familiar with what the species is. What name would you use for this grass? Okay, we've got a couple. Awesome. I gave you a challenging one. I put a grass first instead of a flower. Okay, we've got lots of the same answer, but we've got some other names as well. So as you're typing, I will show you what my quick internet search showed me. So big blue stem, tall blue stem, turkey foot, and blue joint, which I had not heard used for this grass before. So most of you said blue stem, big blue stem, turkey foot. If we did the Latin, there's the Latin, and it just came. I was waiting for someone to put it in there. Andropogon gerardii, okay, is the Latin version for this plant. Now I want to point out one of these names, blue joint. I was surprised to see assigned to this plant because when I think of that name, I think of this grass, which is completely different. So the main common name for this grass is blue joint. But you see the Latin is Calamagrostis canadensis, so nothing close to Andropogon gerardii. Okay, so that can be confusing if you were using blue joint for big blue stem as well. Okay, this is our next one. If you know or have a guess on what this plant is, type in the chat the name that you would use for it. Okay. Didn't know your plant identification skills were going to be tested on the webinar today. All right, we have a lot of more variety with answers today. I kind of tricked you because I put a lighter purple version of this plant, which usually has darker purple petals. But for me, I would call this woodland phlox if I was using the common name, also called wild blue phlox, wild sweet William. Most of you said a phlox of some kind or sweet William. Some of you had the Latin Phlox divaricata. So very good, but we did have a spread of names that we used for this plant. All right, this is the next one. And if you know what it is or have a guess, put it in the chat. If not, I realize it looks like a really nondescript plant, so that's okay if we don't know. But if anyone has a guess, feel free to put that in the chat. Got a few. Okay, they're coming. Just a weed. I love it. That's great. I was waiting for someone to guess that. All right, we got some answers, a lot fewer this time, but that's okay. So I learned this plant, the common name, I learned horseweed. And then I moved much farther south in Illinois, and everyone calls it marestail. But it apparently can also be called coltstail. We have a horse theme going on here, as well as Canadian fleabane, and then butterweed. And butterweed was kind of the ones that confused me because there's a whole other plant that I would consider to be butterweed. But we could clear this up if we used Erigeron canadensis. No one had the Latin on that one this time, but that's okay. Oh, we had one that just came in. So like I said, butterweed is confusing because to me, this is butterweed, the plant that blooms and covers all of our farm fields early in the season. To me, that common name is, this is the plant that comes to mind. So hopefully you're starting to see how just using a common name could lead to some confusion where you may be talking to someone thinking you're talking about the same plant and actually talking about two different plants. This could be a problem if you're talking about having a plant on your property and figuring out if it's a weed and you need to manage it, or if it's fine and you can leave it. If you're trying to buy a specific plant and the person at the nursery thinks you're talking about something else. So this is why understanding the Latin can be helpful for you to at least have in your back pocket. Okay, I put another grass on here. I know this might be tricky. For those that don't know, I teach grass identification too, so I don't even realize I'm putting them in until I'm presenting. Does anyone have a guess on what type of grass this is? Oh, I had one. I was going to say the chat stopped. We've got a couple. All right, I won't wait too long on this. So some of the names that we have, cheatgrass, downy brome. Someone put a smooth brome in there. That's a different species. Downy chest and drooping brome. We could sum all of those up by saying Bromus tectorum. All right. So those were different names for the same thing. Sometimes we can have the same name for a different thing. Okay. So these are two tree species. Depending on who you talk to, they can use the name ironwood to describe this plant. So in the chat, if you're familiar with identifying trees by their bark, and it's fine if you're not, and you use that name ironwood, which of these trees do you call ironwood? The one on the left or the one on the right? And I'm probably going to tally up your answers to try to prove my point to my husband, because we differ on this, on which one is which. Okay, most of you are voting for the right. You've betrayed me all, because it's very clearly the one on the left is what I think. So on the left is what I call ironwood, but you may know as American hop hornbeam or Astraea virginiana. On the right, I call it musclewood because the bark looks very striated, but also known as ironwood, also known as blue beech, muscle beech, and then American hornbeam. So if you look, the two common names for the tree on the left are very close, if not the same, to two of the ones that are used for the tree on the right, Carpinus caroliniana. So very confusing. We need a new name for the tree on the left to clear up some confusion. Okay, we can also run into challenges when we use just a general name to describe plants. So both of these plants, you could describe them as loosestrifes because they are. But if we wanted to be more specific, with our common names, we'd add on an extra word, but then looking at the Latin, we can see how they're more different than they might appear just based on the names. So on the left, we have prairie loosestrife, and on the right, we have purple loosestrife. If you're familiar with purple loosestrife, it's a problematic invasive species. So that would be one that you'd want to manage for. The loosestrife on the left is a very beautiful, desirable native plant that you might want to consider planting. So understanding and being specific with our common names, if we do use them, can be helpful to distinguish between species more than just using a general term. Okay, and then we move into plants that have just really similar names. So we already talked about horseweed on the right. On the left, we have a plant that you might know by scouring rush. That's another name for it, but it's also referred to as horsetail. So we have horseweed, horsetail. Remember that the plant on the right was also called marestail and coltstail. So we have horses and tails for a lot of these plants. And if you don't keep it straight in your head, it's very easy to mix them all together and be confused about what plant you're talking about. Okay, other similar names on the left, we have burnweed, and on the right, we have fireweed. Again, very different plants, but similar common names with our fire theme. Okay, one of my pet peeves is when someone takes a plant and they find a plant that looks really similar and they name it the false version of that original plant. That just is confusing to me because I'm always going to be questioning which one is which. So for example, Solomon seal on the left, Polygonatum commutatum, and on the right, false Solomon seal, Myanthemum racemosum. Okay, main way you can tell them apart is where the flowers are located, but calling them by something different, which there are other common names. You may know this one on the right is Solomon's plume. Still got the same word in it, both Solomon seal, Solomon's plume, but the Latin very different. Okay, another example, bone set and false bone set. Now I will say the Latin isn't that much better. For bone set, we have Eupatorium perfoliatum, and false bone set is Berkelia eupatorioides, which means like a eupatorium. So it's basically doing the same thing, just in Latin, doing like a or a false version of this other plant. So it happens in Latin names as well, just much more commonly in our common names. Okay, we talked about how not all plants have a common name. So just to give some examples, I'm using a grass again, bear with me. There are about 34 different species of panic grasses in the Dicanthelium genus. Not all of them have their own common name. So when that happens, they generally just get a really general genus name. So you'd call this panic grass, but that tells you nothing about which of the 34 that it is, versus the Latin, which would, Dicanthelium laxiflorum. This grass in particular is actually really common, at least in Southern Illinois. I see it all over the place, so it's kind of surprising that it doesn't have a more specific common name. And then another example is a plant in the Euphorbia genus, which are known as spurges, and the common name is just spurge. So again, not very helpful in distinguishing it from the other species of spurges that are also in the same genus. Okay, and then just a few examples of misleading names. So again, to stay with the grass theme, if you're not familiar, there are 3 groups of grass-like plants. They're called grasses, sedges, and rushes. At first glance, they may look similar, but they are quite distinct. But sometimes the way that we name the plants is not helpful at all. So the plant on the left, the common name is bulrush, and it's not a rush, it's actually a sedge. And then the plant on the right is called broom sedge, and it's a grass, not a sedge. So again, already it's throwing off your identification of what those plants may be, because they're named for a completely different group of plants. Okay, other names that can be misleading just at first glance, slippery elm. Typically when you're going up and identifying a plant, if it has a texture in the name, you're probably going to feel the bark or the leaves. It has very rough leaves. They're not smooth at all. The name slippery elm comes from the mucilaginous sap that it has, but I bet you that the first thing that you're doing is not breaking a twig off, cutting it in half, and looking at the sap. So that one always tricks me because I feel a really rough sandpapery leaf and I have to think, okay, that's slippery elm, even though it doesn't feel like it. Another one is when we name plants based on habitat, but they grow in other habitats as well. So swamp milkweed doesn't just grow in swamps, it likes wetter areas, but it also does okay in drier areas and in many home gardens too. I know another name for it is rose milkweed. For me, that gets close to some of the names of our other milkweeds, like our purple milkweed. So I like Asclepias incarnata, and incarnata actually means pink, so it describes it pretty well. All right, let's move into what I like to call the unfortunate names that just when you think about it, don't sound that pleasant. So first we have plants with the word wart in their name. And of course, the wart in this case, W-O-R-T, comes from the Old English word wart, spelled W-Y-R-T. And that had a whole bunch of different meanings. It means plant, it means root, it means herb. So in a lot of cases, these plants either looked like a different part of the body, or they were used medicinally to help heal that part of the body. So there, and sometimes you just don't really know why it's named that, like in the case of spiderwort up here on the screen. But just to give some examples, we have a spleenwort fern, toothwort, bladderwort, and then spiderwort. So you can guess perhaps what these plants were used for medicinally based on the name. Some other unfortunate common names, liver leaf. I mean, it makes sense because it has 3 lobes. So getting closer to what a lobed liver looks like. Bleeding hearts, I never liked that name. When you stop and think about it, it doesn't really sound that pleasant. And then blood root. And if you've ever planted blood root before, you've had a reason to be digging it up and had permission to dig it up. The root really is bright red. And I'm kicking myself because I was planting some this year and didn't take my camera out and take a picture of the red root, but it is very bright red and beautiful to see if you ever get the chance. Okay, just some other unfortunate names. Mother-in-law's tongue, named for the sharp pointed leaves on the Sansevieria plant. Yarrow, this is what I call yarrow. I learned is also called devil's nettle, which is confusing because it's not a nettle, but apparently was once used to rid evil spirits. And then stinking hellebore, which if you look at the Latin name, it kind of has the same ring to it that's based on the rank odor that this plant can have. All right, and then I wanted to spend a little bit of time focused on the word weed, as it's included in many of our plants and many of our native plants that we've been encouraging folks to plant in native plant gardens to help pollinators, excuse me. But if a plant has the word weed in it, you may stay away from it and not be interested in planting that. So let's look at what a weed is and why we name plants weeds. So it really is a human term, right? Weeds are plants out of place for us. So what I consider to be a weed, you may not consider to be a weed. You may not like to have any violets in your lawn, and my lawn is full of violets and I don't consider them to be a weed. But why are these plants considered weedy? Oftentimes they have one or several of the traits listed below. So oftentimes they are able to establish readily in disturbed areas, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's the only place they will grow. Oftentimes they're able to establish and grow very quickly and spread very quickly. They often produce many, many seeds, hundreds, even thousands of seeds that can live and survive in the soil for several years to several decades even. And they often also can spread vegetatively, like through rhizomes as well. Okay, but I'm going to show some examples of plants that maybe deserve a rebranding and shouldn't necessarily have the word weed in their name. So up first we have rosinweed, or Silphium integrifolium. If you're familiar with silphiums, they're kind of the quintessential sunflower plants of the prairie. This one in particular doesn't spread as aggressively as others, and so maybe shouldn't be lumped in the weed category. One of my personal favorite plants of all time is butterfly milkweed, also referred to as butterfly weed. It is our one milkweed that doesn't have milky sap, which is why I think a lot of the times it's called butterfly weed. But Asclepias tuberosa sounds much better. And while this plant does survive very well on roadsides and other disturbed areas, it's also typically found in high quality remnant sites too. So the name's a little bit of a misnomer. Okay, poor sneezeweed. Sneezeweed does not have a great name. And looking into the background of why it was named sneezeweed, leaves were once crushed up to make a snuff to encourage sneezing to rid evil spirits. Okay, so it has nothing to do with your allergies. But I know when I read sneezeweed, that's what I thought of. And just as a reminder, plants that are the cause of your allergies most of the time are ones that have airborne pollen. That means that they're wind pollinated. So if you have a flower that's pollinated by insects, typically the pollen's too heavy to travel on the wind, so it's not getting into your nasal passages and causing problems. So sneezeweed is a lovely little plant to have, will not make you sneeze. Jewelweed on the right. If you've been around waterways, you've probably seen jewelweed growing. Grows very heavily in dense patches, but is a really wonderful plant. And if you're curious on why it's named jewelweed, if you've never taken a leaf off and held it under the water, hold the leaf upside down under the water and you'll see this silver sheen on the bottom of the leaf that catches the light. You kind of have to move the leaf around a little bit to see it, but it's really cool and it grows near waterways, so it's very easy to just pluck a leaf off and look at it under the water. Okay, and then just last two examples of plants with weed in their name that we might want to rebrand: Joe Pye weed and ironweed. These do get to be taller species, so you could say that their growth is more weedy, but really beneficial ecologically for insects and other wildlife. Now, maybe some plants that are aptly named with weed in their name. We've got American bindweed, common ragweed, and a smartweed species. So these typically, again, grow in disturbed habitats, maybe grow in a way that we don't want, like bindweed, that's a vine, maybe cause our allergies, like ragweed, because it has windborne pollen. And then smartweed, I think it's a bad rap because it really is a great plant for pollinators, but you typically only see it growing in disturbed habitats. But we could rebrand them with all of the Latin names below and not have that weed in there if we wanted to. Okay, so I've been talking a lot about how common names can be confusing. They're not necessarily the most beneficial, but there definitely are some that are very good that we have them and we use them regularly because they help us watch out for some undesirable plants. So I'm sure we're all familiar with at least the first two, poison ivy and stinging nettle. Those names are great. I'm glad that we know them and that we use them so that we're able to stay safe around these plants. And then devil's walking stick. You never want to be falling down a hillside and reach up and the tree that you grab is devil's walking stick because that would be very painful. So that one's aptly named as well. All right. My next question for you, pull up that chat box again. And I want you, based on the names and the pictures, tell me which of these three grasses, bear with me, are most closely related? What is your guess? If you had to pick two that are most closely related to each other, paying attention to the names and what they look like, or you could ignore all of that and make a separate guess. What is your guess for the two that are most closely related to one another? Okay. We have lots of votes for little blue stem and broom sedge because they look similar. We had some for little blue stem and big blue stem based on the name. And some of you have caught on, or you're grass experts, and it's actually big blue stem and broom sedge, the two on the right, that are most closely related to one another. And we can tell that based on their Latin names. So while big blue is Andropogon gerardii, we saw that one earlier, broom sedge, Andropogon virginicus. Okay, little blue stem is in its own genus, Schizachyrium scoparium. Okay, so Just because common names are similar doesn't mean it tells you about the evolutionary relationship of plants. And just because they look similar doesn't necessarily mean that they are in fact closely related to one another. All right, we talked about how Latin names can be helpful. So they're helpful in indicating plants that are closely related to one another. So we have prairie clovers here on the left, Dahlia purpurea, on the right, Dahlia candida, both in the same genus. They look similar. So this one actually did work out. They look similar and they're in the same genus. And then the names too are descriptive. So candida refers to white, and then purpurea, of course, is purple. A lot of the times we have plants that have an origin name attached to them. Most of the time they're accurate, but not always. So Solidago canadensis here, or goldenrod canadensis, means it was first named in Canada. And that's important. It doesn't necessarily mean that the plant is from that area, and especially with the Canadian plants, just because it's from Canada, it's most likely native to the US as well, right? It's native to North America. So remember that when we talk about plants with canadensis, that doesn't mean non-native as a default. And then unfortunately, common milkweed was named Asclepias syriaca, first named in Syria. No, it was not. So Linnaeus was confused on this one, and we're not quite sure why he named it syriaca, but he seems to have been confused when he named that plant. Okay, other descriptive names. On the right, this plant is called self-heal or heal-all. Prunella vulgaris. Vulgaris means common. And if you've seen this plant growing, it usually grows along pathways and in larger patches. Southern magnolia on the left, Magnolia grandiflora. That's an easy one. Large flower grandiflora. Okay. And our last example, rattlesnake master, Eryngium yuccifolium. Yuccifolium means leaves like a yucca. And if you're familiar with yucca plants, these leaves do resemble them quite closely. Okay, I mentioned that sometimes names can change, scientific names can change. So just put a few examples for you. So shooting star used to be Dodecatheon medii, and it was changed to Primula medii. And then marble seed, which we saw earlier, used to be Anosmodium mole, and it was changed to Lithospermum mole. All right, so I've been saying a lot of Latin names, probably somewhat incorrectly, but here we're going to go through some tips for Latin pronunciation. So this is the part of the webinar where stay muted, but feel free to sound out the names with me as we go. And if you look up anything about pronouncing Latin, the name that you'll see is William Stearns, and he was kind of the authority on Latin plant name pronunciation. And I love this quote from him because it should hopefully reassure you. He says that while botanical Latin is a written language, the scientific names of plants often occur in speech. How they're pronounced matters little, provided they sound pleasant and are understood by all concerned. Okay, just some tips. It sounds obvious, but pronounce every letter and in the correct order, and then break the words down into syllables. So if you see a word that's this long, break it down into chunks and say each of the individual chunks. I will also mention, if you do a quick internet search and you're looking up Latin pronunciation, like I said before, scientific pronunciation is different than more traditional, like church Latin pronunciation. And then American Latin is different than European. And oftentimes what's okay in one is very clearly wrong and like a faux pas if you say it in the other. So just keep that in mind, that you may see conflicting information. And so look into the source and see where it's coming from to clear that up. Okay, so we're gonna go back to our early learning days and remember our short and long vowels, okay, and what those sound like. And why that's helpful is if a Latin word ends in a vowel, you're gonna pronounce that vowel as the long vowel. So the A, E, I, O, U, except A, which is always pronounced short. So you're never going to end a Latin word in A, it will be a. So let's look at some examples. So we have asarum, doesn't end in a vowel, so we're good. If we said this, many of you might say it as canadense, right? But if we follow this rule, we're going to say the E like the long E. So it's canadense. Asarum canadense. Okay, the next one, gentiana, not gentiana. There's no sh sound in Latin. Gentiana, short A. And then a double I is pronounced a little differently, Andrewsii, EI, Andrewsii. One thing to note, this is very clearly named after someone. And if a plant is named after someone, it can break that convention on how some of the vowels and syllables are pronounced. So I said before, there's no sh in Latin, but if it's in someone's name, you would say it. Clear as mud, right? We got to complicate everything for you. Let's look at one more. Persicaria, carii. Persicaria, carii. Okay. We also have double vowels that when said together are pronounced differently than the vowels are said individually. These are called diphthongs. Okay, so when we find those, we're going to pronounce them differently. So when you find an AE together, you're going to treat it as a long E. Okay, so this one always gets me. Give me a second. Circeae luteana, Circeae luteana, Symphyotrichum novi Anglii, and then Eleagnis umbellata. So again, break it down into syllables. L-E, right? Or A-E is a long E. Agnes umbellata. Okay, when you have an O-E, you can treat it as a long or a short E. Okay, so we could say Scenoplectus, and I'm not even going to do the second one. I need a break. Scenoplectus. Why do I not do a CH like a ch? Because that sound is not in Latin either. We'll look at that in a second. So Scenoplectus. AU is treated like ah. Areolaria flava. Areolaria. EI is treated like a long I. Waldsteinia. Fragarioides. And we'll look at that in a second. Waldsteinia, that's the important part to remember. EU treated like a U, Eupatorium perfoliatum. Okay, one that's not a diphthong is OI, but American pronunciation treats it like it is. So Symphyotrichum ericoides, we say it like an oil, the OI, ericoides. If you were in Europe, they would say it ericoides. Okay, so for me, you could say it either way, ericoides, ericoides. Okay, fragarioides or fragarioides for this one up here. Okay, a few other tips. If you have two U's together, the first U is long and the second is short. This is one of my favorite plant names to say because there's way too many U's in it. Saururus cernuus. Cernuus, okay, long, short. And then we have examples of when we have silent first letters. So when you have any of these pairings together, if it starts the word, the first letter is silent. If it's in the middle of the word, you would pronounce both of the letters, okay? So Nephalium, Sorelidium. This one, we have a PT at the start, so the P is silent, but we have an MN in the middle, and we say both the M and the N. So Telimnium nutalii, Telimnium nutalii. Okay, I also already said CH is pronounced K. So Stachys palustris, this plant. Kiloni, remember? CH like a K and the long E at the end. So not Chilone, Kiloni glabra. Then Polysticum acrosticoides or acrosticoides, however you want to say it. Okay, and then if we look at family names, so right, our Latin names, we focus on the genus and the specific epithet. If you go up a step to family names, as a convention, they all end in the letters A, C, E, A, E. And we break it down and say ACE. Okay, remember the AE is a diphthong that's treated like a long E. So Malvaceae, Lamiaceae, Poaceae, Fabaceae, Cyperaceae, Orchidaceae, Orabancaceae, right? CH is a K, Orabancaceae, Scrofulariaceae. Okay, I hope you're all saying these at the same time at home. And if anyone's at the room next door wondering what you're watching right now. All right, as we wrap up today, we're going to go through some examples. Yes, some of them can be a mouthful. The important thing is to break them down. So what I tried to do here is break them down into syllables. This was just me typing it out, so you may do it slightly different. So this is, again, we stay muted, but we're going to practice saying them out loud. Okay. This one is Hukara Richardsonii. So K sound for this CH, but we're going to do the ch because this is named after someone. Again, clear as mud. Hukara Richardsonii. Okay. Some of them are easy and would sound just like you would think they would. Ratibida columnifera. Ratibida columnifera. We had the MN together. It's in the middle of the word, so we pronounce both of them. Columnifera. Okay. It's not gem. Geum. Geum triflorum. Geum triflorum. Okay. Asarum canadense. Canadense. Zizia aurea. Zizia aurea. This one is my favorite Latin name, probably, to say, because it looks really intimidating, but it's actually super simple when you break it down. Silphium terebinthanaceum. Terebinthanaceum. Silphium terebinthanaceum. Okay, and our last one, Lobelia cardinalis or cardinalis. Lobelia cardinalis. So as we wrap up today, in conclusion, common names, very easy to remember, really easy to use, but hopefully I've showed that they have some limitations. Scientific names can be challenging at first. You may still think they are, and that's okay. I definitely learned a lot about my own Latin pronunciation in putting this together and realized that I have been saying some names wrong for a long time. But that's okay. We learn and then we practice and we start incorporating those as well. But hopefully you can take some of these tips and tricks and use those as you move forward. I will also mention the handout that was sent in the email about an hour prior to the webinar today has a lot of the information on tips for pronunciation that I talked about. So if you want a handy go-to guide, keep that handout, print that out, and use that as your reference. Okay, we want to put a plug for next month's webinar with Eliana Brown and Lane Kanoki. We don't yet have the registration up, but it should be up shortly. And since you register for this webinar, you'll get an email if you are interested in registering for next month's webinar. So with that, I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you all for being here today, bearing with me. as I pronounced a lot of Latin words. If you have any feedback, please either scan the QR code or go to the short URL listed on the screen that I think Peggy is going to drop in the chat. And then as always, if you have any questions, you can feel free to send me an email.